So how would we say that types relate to the promise? So the promise is propositional revelation of what is to come. Types, how do they relate to that? They elaborate upon and illustrate in more detail the promise.
Well, Paul looks back at the Old Testament and he speaks about the mystery of Christ. And what he's talking about is that the revelation of all that Christ would do was present in the Old Testament, but it was present in the mode of mystery. So it's revealed, but it's revealed partially, it's revealed obscurely, it's revealed uh, in dark ways. We could add a bunch of adverbs to say kind of the same thing, to say it was revealed mysteriously. There's a veil that's over it. And so typology reveals Christ not directly in a sense, but indirectly. It's not, so for example, animal sacrifices, it's not this animal is Christ and its blood is Christ's blood, because the writer to the Hebrews says, no, it can't do what Christ's blood does. But it does tell you God accepts sacrificial victims as to make atonement. God will accept the blood of another, a pure and perfect uh, offering or victim, to make atonement. And so that is teaching you something. It is affecting purification of the flesh in and of itself, but it's also teaching you something other and greater, that God will accept blood for the remission of sins. This is what God will do, and so as there is a reminder of sins in the sacrificial system, so it pushes subserviently the Old Testament saint or the Old Testament Jew to look above and beyond the animal sacrificial system to something other and greater. And so it's not that the type in itself accomplishes something, but it points you to Christ who accomplishes something, and therefore is a means of connection. It is a type. And so therefore, it through mystery, it's not a direct or an obvious or a clear portrayal of Jesus Christ, but rather, and it is nevertheless a portrayal of Jesus Christ and his blood. And so I think that talking about mystery, incorporating Paul's category of mystery into typology, is a helpful way of acknowledging that types are absolutely portraying Jesus Christ, but they do it in an obscure, a partial way. And I would recommend Benjamin Glad and Greg Beale's book on mystery. It's very helpful. Of course, I wrote The Mystery of Christ, His Covenant and His Kingdom, which you could look at. But that's how I understand Paul's use of mystery, and that's how I would understand typology revealing Christ. It does reveal him, but in a sense, secondarily and indirectly.
Yeah, I think that the New Testament helps us with some of the things you were just talking about. For instance, in First Peter 1, verses 10 and following, as to this salvation, that would be the salvation that the recipients of Peter's letter were now experiencing. The prophets, who I take to be the writing prophets of the old era, the prophets who prophesied of the grace that would come to you, made careful search and inquiry, an interesting combination of words there. If you do a search on the Septuagint use of those words, I think a couple places in the New Testament, they are quite often words that indicate searching extant documents. So I'm not the only one that says this. I think the prophets were reading the prophets and trying to put things together, seeking to know what person or time, and this is very interesting, the Spirit of Christ, Christ being a mediatorial title, here is the Spirit of Christ within them, indicating as he predicted the sufferings of Christ and the glories to follow, which were often revealed in their writings through the motif of typology. And when the New Testament comes along, when the Lord comes along, the fulfillment, that to which the Christological types pointed to, and then the divine commentary on the coming of Christ, the Gospels, the book of Acts, the epistles and the book of Revelation, how the type functioned in light of the antitypical fulfillment and the divine record of it, the writings of the New Testament, how the types function becomes clearer to us, but it doesn't mean it wasn't getting through to at least some people. It means we got, the mystery is now here. The fog is removed, which
Right.
brings rise to a question I've had. The knowledge of types in the consciousness of people before the incarnation, sufferings, and glory of our Lord and the New Testament. It's a good question. I don't know exactly how to answer it. Did they have to have the knowledge that these of these types? Today we have true believers that believe the Trinity, but aren't necessarily able to articulate it clearly. They should just, repeat the words of the doxology and the Gloria Patri and just say, leave it at that. But does that mean they're not saved because they don't understand the significance of the New Testament's clear teaching on the doctrine of the Trinity, or at least they can't articulate it? So that's kind of the way I go back to the Old Testament era when people ask, well, did they understand it as a type? I'm not so sure it's necessary to say, well, yeah, all the elect believers understood all the typology of the Old Testament.
I think that I think it's safe. You make a good point of we should not overstate the knowledge of Old Testament believers, but we do have biblical data to state the knowledge of Old Testament believers. So, for example, we're told that Abraham knew that there was a heavenly country. He knew that there was an inheritance greater than Canaan. We're also told that they did, and the prophets that you just mentioned, they knew there is one to come. Because from Genesis 3:15 onward, they know God has promised the undoing of the curse. They know from Genesis 12, God has promised a blessing for the nations from us, from the Jews according to the flesh. So they have a sense of that future, that, like you said, that eschatological hope. And the scriptures assure us of that. They tell us of that. And, Jesus says, if you believed Moses, you would believe me. And so Christ is there, and there were people who understood it sufficiently. But we have the post mystery knowledge of it, and they had the mystery knowledge of it. Their knowledge was mysterious, their faith was mysterious, ours is not. And I think that's a sufficient way to state it without trying to specify sort of the quantitative knowledge of Old Testament saints. Quantitatively, it was far inferior to ours in many ways, but qualitatively, it's the same object of faith, correct? And so, therefore, the same salvation.
Interesting about, the object of faith that Christ has promised. Uh, Christ has promised. The content of their faith in terms of eschatological hope, according to Hebrews 11, there's 2 or 3 or 4 folks there that are listed that had an eschatological hope that didn't exclusively terminate on the first coming of our Lord. It would be new heavens, new earth kind of thing, which is very interesting. Because here we had people without the New Testament, without the incarnation, sufferings, and glory of Christ, that were looking beyond the promise terminating in the incarnation to an eschatological hope beyond that, which is fascinating. That puts some meat, on the bones of the content of their faith, included more than just bare minimum kind of stuff. Unless you disagree with the writer of the Hebrews, who we all know is Paul.
Yeah, he was Paul. I agree.